Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. I'm Ty Fischer, your host, and here at Veritas Academy, we teach a number of different subjects. One of the most interesting that we teach, because it's not taught, as I think Uncle Andrew says in The Magician's Nephew, don't they teach logic at those schools anymore? Well, we do teach logic here at Veritas Academy. I'm blessed to have Nathaniel Stamper, our logic teacher here at Veritas, with us today, and we're going to talk about teaching students to think critically. So, Nathaniel, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Ty. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah. So, what is logic?
Well, that, of course, is a great question to start with, especially because I teach my logic students before any kind of debate or argumentation, that we always begin by defining our terms.
Right.
So logic, we define logic as the science and art of reasoning well. The science and art of reasoning well.
So how's it a science and how's it an art?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question because I spend an entire day, the first day of logic, explaining that to the 7th graders. So as a science, what we mean is that there are rules, there are principles that the students need to learn in order to understand logic. Okay. But as an art, we have to be careful not to apply those rules in a wooden fashion.
Okay.
So the one of the examples I give them is in Scripture, when somebody sins against us, there's a prescription for how we go about handling that.
Sure.
Matthew 18.
Yeah, Matthew 18.
Right. So when someone sins against us, we go to that person, as Matthew 18 says, and if need be, we come back with a witness. However, I asked the students, I said, when somebody sins against you, should you always confront them and go to them? I said, how would that work in a marriage? You know?
Well, I mean, for my wife, it'd be terrible because she sins against me all the time. I never sin against her, though, thankfully.
So, Proverbs gives us another option.
Yeah.
Blessed is the one who overlooks the transgressions of another. So then I asked the students, I said, we have 2 rules here in Scripture, and they seem to be inconsistent. They seem to, what we say in logic, contradict.
Yeah.
And I said, how do we resolve that? And they begin working through the art of how to apply these rules. And they say, well, I don't think we need to confront every sin.
Yeah.
And that's where Proverbs comes in. We can overlook that sin. And then I say, okay, well, let's work on the art of how we apply Matthew 18. Inevitably, one of the principles they come up with is, well, it should be if it's like a habitual behavior, if we're seeing a pattern. And then I say, yes, that's what we're talking about with logic, too.
Okay.
We learn the rules, we learn the laws, but we have to artfully, skillfully apply them.
Yeah, that's great. So what kinds of logic do we teach here at Veritas? Are there different kinds?
So, yes, here at Veritas, they have introductory logic in 7th grade.
Okay.
And then intermediate logic in 8th grade.
Okay.
And we cover formal logic, informal logic, and underneath the branches of formal logic, we're going to cover what's called categorical logic.
Okay.
That's in 7th grade.
Okay, and that would be syllogisms, right?
Yes, sir. Syllogisms.
Okay.
So right now, probably our listeners are starting to glaze over. All right. So what that means is,
thanks for warning me.
In categorical logic, we look at how statements, how they relate with their terms. And we try to come up with arguments which are sound.
Okay.
They're true. They're valid. The premises actually imply the conclusions.
Yes.
And we do that by examining the terms that are used in any argument.
So I remember the first one that we always learned was, all men are mortal, all Socrates is a man, all Socrates are mortal.
Right. Yeah.
So if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates is mortal.
Okay.
Right. So that's what you're looking for. It's validity, right?
Validity. That's very good. So the students come into logic and they all want to argue right away. And they think the basis of an argument is it true? But with validity, What we're asking is, do the premises properly imply the conclusions? Because you can have an argument that is true, but it's invalid. The
Right.
premises aren't applying the conclusion.
Right. Your conclusion might be Jesus is Lord, which is true. But if you're not making a right argument, if you're not making a valid argument, it's not a good argument.
It's not
that
a very
Jesus
good
is
argument.
Lord. Yeah.
And we say when an argument is true and it's valid, then we say it is a sound argument.
So we spend, like you said, 2 years studying logic and then really trying to get students to apply logic everywhere, right? Why is it so important for students to know logic and to be able to think critically in our day?
Yeah, Ty, that's a great question. 3 reasons. 1, it is important here at Veritas.
Okay, yes, it is.
So you're not going to be able to write a very good paper.
Because you teach apologetics and junior thesis,
Apologetics and junior thesis. They're not going to be able to write a very good senior thesis if it's not argued well.
Right.
So 1, they need it for the purposes here at school.
Okay.
But 2, beyond that, thinking more universally, we want these students to be prepared as they become adults.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want them being swayed by silly arguments or invalid arguments
Sure.
that sound rich
Yeah.
and true. We want them to be able to think critically, not necessarily have a critical heart, but we want them to think critically. And then the third reason, I think, is because it's obedience to the Lord. It's obedience to the Lord. So 1 Peter 3:15, one of many verses that I think draws on the importance of logic.
Okay.
Christians are called to be ready to make a defense or a reason for their faith, for their hope that is within them. Okay, you can't do that if you can't reason well.
Yeah.
The prophet says, "Come, let us reason together." Right? So I tell my students this. God has created the world, and in it there are moral laws that reflect his character.
Mm-hmm.
So then I'll ask the students, well, what happens when you disobey those moral laws? And they say, well, we sin and we dishonor the Lord. Well, then what happens when you obey those moral laws? We honor the Lord. I say, okay, well, in the same way, there are laws of logic embedded in creation.
Yep.
And they reflect God's character. So when you reason well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And they say, we're honoring the Lord.
Yeah, it is. It is honoring God. And it's also, you're talking about Christians making a defense. In our culture now, whereas maybe, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, a lot of Christianity would have just been taken for granted, even by people who weren't really believers. But now there are, as I was listening to a podcast recently, people were pointing out people aren't objecting to the truth of Christianity. They're objecting to the morality of Christianity, which is another reason why you've got to be ready to make that defense. You've got to be ready to think critically, because the weapons that are being thrown at you are going to be changing. So you've got to have those skills.
Yes, sir. And we don't really have home field advantage anymore.
No, we don't. That's a great way to put it.
We have to be prepared, and we cannot just take this for granted any longer.
So logic's been one of those things that's been at the core of this renewal of classical Christian education. And in Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, she says something like, some will say that teaching teenage students logic will make them interminable. Do you remember how she answers that?
Yes, I think so. This is when she talks about they can tend to be intolerable.
Yeah.
And she says, well, they're going to be intolerable anyhow. So we might as well steer their argumentativeness and abstract thinking in a godly direction for a godly purpose.
You might as well get something out of it.
Yes.
So do you have any problem stirring up arguments among 7th and 8th graders, or are they ready to jump in? Can they really do this thing that we're asking them to do? How much work does it take to get them to start to think logically?
Yes, Ty, that's another great question. So they show up to the first class ready to argue. They want to bring up politics. They want to bring up any kind of controversial topic they can to debate about. But what they quickly see is they're not very good at it.
Mm-hmm.
They think they are, but it quickly gets exposed. So I've said this before. Teaching logic it's a lot like placing a weapon in their hands, like a sword. Okay. And in order to handle a sword, that requires skill and discipline. Students come into Logic 1 excited. They're ready to argue. My job is to show them how you do that, to give them that skill and that discipline to think through this in a coherent fashion.
But that's a really good analogy that you have there, because you might say, well, I'm just going to throw away the sword. I'm not going to be a participant in this. That really doesn't work in this area, though, because you're just at the mercy of people that have that sword. They're going to be the people persuading and making arguments. And your job, our job as a school, is to teach them how to bear that sword well, because bearing it badly or bearing it sinfully does so much damage.
Yeah, it will hurt themselves and hurt others. And God has created us in his image to be thinking, interpreting beings. So they will, in that metaphor, they will use that sword. It's just a matter of how they will use it.
Yeah. So one of the things we study is logical fallacies, and this would be, I think, a more in informal logic. And why is it handy to know them? Do you have any favorite fallacies, and why?
Well, so I define logic as the art and science of reasoning well. And we define in class reasoning as drawing proper conclusions from other information. So defining logical fallacies would be drawing improper conclusions from information. Yeah, it's of course it's important to know fallacies. It's the basis of understanding when an argument's gone wrong.
Sure.
Right? And you hear it, of course, in election season.
Oh, yes, you do.
You see it on the news. The students they're gonna face it when they walk outside the classroom into the world. They're gonna feel it and experience it in the classroom as well.
Absolutely.
So one of the funny things about teaching logic to students is they will hold you accountable for the logic you're teaching them.
Right.
So there's been times in class where a student has stopped me and said, "Well, Mr. Stamper, isn't that a fallacy?"
Oh no.
Yeah, I had to think about it. Yes, sir. Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's we have to teach our students to do that respectfully, but you do here at Veritas, you put yourself on the line as a teacher in some ways that you wouldn't have to at other schools, because people are not going to, isn't that the fallacy of division?
Yeah. So teaching the students logic, there's a certain vulnerability that comes then with being a teacher at Veritas, doesn't there?
Yeah.
But you ask about my favorite fallacy. There's two things we're doing this year that is really exciting for me with both logic classes. One is we're continuing to teach all of the formal and informal fallacies.
Okay.
But the second thing that I introduced this year is cognitive biases.
Okay.
So biases are basically, there's shortcuts in our thinking, and that's not bad. We all come up with subconscious ways of making shortcuts. But these shortcuts lead to subjective judgments or prejudices.
Okay.
So one of the biases I just taught to my class was the bias of anchoring.
Okay.
Anchoring. And what that is your first judgment will then affect your subsequent judgments.
Okay.
And I said, you all already know this bias. I said, how? Virtually every hand in the class went up. And they said, yeah, this is like when I get into a fight with my sibling and something breaks, and I'm the first one to mom to tell them what happened. So mom has my side of the story when making her judgment.
Sure, you're trying to get mom to drop that anchor right there.
So the biases, I'm very excited about introducing those this year as well. And both the biases and the fallacies will help them in Omnibus.
Yeah.
When they're
reading
great books of literature. It will help them when they're doing research for writing a paper. They're going to be conscious of their own biases when doing research.
It'll help them keep from making mistakes with their own kids, right?
Yes.
When one runs in first to say, Jimmy broke it.
Yeah. Mom, he's anchoring.
Yeah, no.
So you asked me about my favorite fallacy. I didn't answer that, but the loaded question. And that's when we ask a question with the assumption built into it. It's already baked in. So there's no way to answer that question without appearing guilty.
Right. The classical one is, have you stopped beating your wife?
A lawyer asks, have you stopped beating your wife?
You say yes, and then you're admitting to doing it. You say no, and you're still a wife beater. So that's a terrible
So last year
trap.
Last year was the school year was the Johnny Depp trial.
Oh yeah.
And the students were seeing those clips on TikTok and YouTube, and they would come into class. They're, with the internet, they have access to that.
Oh, so many good logical fallacy examples there.
They were bringing them in, and
it's
they
like
were
an
asking,
ocean.
They were saying, Mr. Stamper, did you see this loaded question?
Oh my goodness, I didn't think about that.
Oh yeah, Kyle Rittenhouse, Johnny Depp. Anytime these trials are somewhat notable, the students are on it.
You've got ripples coming into class.
Yeah, I don't even have to talk about it. They bring it in.
Wow, that's great. So let's take this in a more theological direction, because your background. I mean, you've served as a pastor in the PCA, only PCA, or yeah.
PCA, yes, I'm ordained in the PCA.
Okay. So is God logical? How do we think about God in relationship to logic?
Right. So earlier I brought up the moral laws that God has created in the universe. So you could almost ask that, like, is God moral? Are there these standards outside of God that he has to obey? No. These standards are reflections of who he is, of his character and attributes. So logic comes from God. It's not a principle by which he's adhering to. Yeah. That is who he is.
We don't measure him by those standards. Those standards are just what he's like.
Right. Jesus doesn't say, follow me, I know the way to truth. He says, follow me, I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah.
So logic becomes a reflection of who he is, and it's baked into our creation. You cannot escape it.
Yeah. Well, recently, and by recently, I'm 5 or 10 years ago, there was a debate tour, the Collision Tour with Douglas Wilson and Christopher Hitchens was going across the country. I got to see them at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. And Hitchens, of course, very gifted thinker and speaker, but he would have used what he was saying was the laws of logic. The laws of logic would be reasons to destroy or deny the Christian faith. Should we worry about things like that, or that seems to be, when we think about the new atheists, you get those kind of rationalistic attacks against Christianity. So some people might even, you could be a believer thinking, man, logic is not a good thing. I mean, it's something it's a tool that's being used against the Christian faith.
I think it's just the opposite.
Okay.
So where do those laws come from? Were they randomly generated? Right? If there's laws and they're so rational, did that just spontaneously happen?
Yeah.
If there's a law, there must be a lawgiver.
And what Hitchens was clear about is, he believed in a naturalistic beginning of the universe. And then you're like, oh, well, it just turned out really nifty, didn't it? Like
very convenient for us.
Very convenient. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bahnsen was also in another famous debate with Stein.
Now you're talking about
Dr. Bahnsen, Greg Bahnsen.
Greg Bahnsen, yeah. David Bahnsen has done a podcast with us.
So that would have been his father.
Yeah.
So he was in a debate with Stein, and Stein, of course, was an atheist. And as an atheist, he said, well, there's nothing immaterial that exists. There's only the material world. And then Bahnsen asked him, well, are there laws of logic? And he said, yes. And he said, are they immaterial or material?
Yeah. Got, was it, did he say checkmate after that? Or
I think there was one point. He said, I actually won the debate merely by you showing up. Right? So these things that we know are in creation, they reflect the Creator. Even the unbeliever has to borrow them from our Christian worldview in order to make sense out of their world.
Yeah. Well, I was talking with a Christian leader recently, and he criticized Christian schools. And he criticized them because he said Christian education tends to create compliant children. He thought that we should be creating courageous children, not compliant children in our age. So there's that balance that you have to look at for giving these kids the tools, the sword that's going to make them courageous, and teaching them to be respectful and those kinds of things. But how do you wrestle with in an age like ours where you're being flooded sometimes with lies, how do you keep them from being just compliant instead of courageous?
That's a great question. I'm reading That Hideous Strength right now.
Okay.
By C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite books. And
Does it ever make you worried about, like, what's in the newspaper today?
Yeah, to a certain degree, there's concern. But the two main characters are a married couple, Mark Studdock and Jane, his wife. And Mark's idol of the heart is to belong. And it makes him compliant in the wrong ways. And Jane's idol of the heart is that independence, autonomy that can make her, presumptuous and to a certain degree, maybe even bold, courageous.
Yeah.
But it's rooted in the wrong thing. And in that book, it's beautiful, a little more than halfway through it. They both are learning that repentance is making Mark courageous in the right way. And it's making Jane compliant in the right way. And we need virtue and we need Christ to root that in, right? So when there's lies that need to be addressed, the students can stand up and speak truth, right? And when it's good, when it's true, good, and beautiful to be compliant and to obey whoever is in authority over them, then they will know that.
Sure.
But that, again, takes not only knowledge, it takes wisdom and it takes virtue.
Right, it does. It does. So what do you enjoy most about teaching logic? I mean, I think when you're coming here, that, teaching theology and teaching, books that the Bible and that kind of stuff, that probably would have come very naturally to you. What do you enjoy most about teaching logic?
What these children are learning in these 2 years will serve them their entire lives. It's inescapable. Yeah. No matter how much they take away from the course, even if they would only take away 40%, it will serve them the rest of their lives, and it will change them.
Yeah.
It will make in them an obedience, right? They're honoring Christ's laws of logic embedded in creation. They will think critically, and they will seek truth. And what makes me personally excited about that is that I get to be this tool in the Lord's hand to explore these concepts and principles together. And you see students who come in here who maybe they think they're only average, they have average grades, but all of a sudden they realize they have this gift and they start excelling in logic. And you can see it in their eyes when their eyes get wide and open and they get that little smile. I got it.
That sounds pretty enjoyable. Now, interestingly enough, today we're recording this on a day here at Veritas when we invite in people who disagree with our school's statement of faith to especially talk with our juniors and seniors and to allow them to be questioned and to question. And we had one in today. I'm not sure if he would describe himself as a Marxist, but he would definitely, I think, say kind of an anti-capitalist. And I just had the privilege I had a Subway sandwich and decided I would go out and sit in our nice new gathering space there with our seniors. And they were just like taking apart all of the arguments and turning them over and saying, well, this doesn't really lead to this. Like they're taking those tools that you're giving to students now and using them in real life. So you're right about that. Any recommendations that you would give to parents to help them enjoy and encourage critical thinking in their children?
I have a friend who, when he would watch like Disney movies with his children, or even something simple like a commercial, he would say, "What are they trying to tell you?
Yeah.
What's the message here?" Right? Not that he would necessarily hide them from watching commercials or certain films, but what are they saying? Well, Dad, if I buy those jeans, then I'll be happy.
Yes.
Right. And what he was doing was he was teaching them hermeneutics. He was teaching them to interpret and to think critically about the message. So I think that there's one thing is have conversations with your children. And don't assume that because, they're in 7th and 8th grade, they can't think on this level. Right. So the 8th grade asked me a question last week, a logic question. and I didn't know the answer, and they asked me right at the end of class. So during my my preparation period, I went to the blackboard. It took me 30 minutes to figure this question out, coming from 8th graders.
Wow.
And I went back into their last period class. They had Miss Espenshade. I said, can I borrow 2 minutes of your class just to explain to them the answer? She said, sure. I go in there and I start explaining it. And about 10 seconds through, one of the students raises his hand and says, Mr. Stamper, we figured that out like 4 periods ago.
Oh, no.
So, you know, God has made these kids, he's made all people to be able to think critically and at an early age. So to try those exercises with children. 2 other things. There's a resource written by a minister. It's a brand new book. I believe it just came out a couple months ago. It's called Logic for Christians by Zach Lee.
Okay.
And that's going to be sort of a broad overview of what I'm covering with the logic students here.
Okay.
There's another.
You mean parents could learn to think more critically as well?
They could learn this as well. Yes. There's another resource. There's a website called yourlogicalfallacyis.com. And
sounds like a scary place.
And on that website, they have all of the fallacies, all of the biases listed, and they make them easy to memorize because they put little icons. It looks like the little icons you would see on the app on your phone. So you can associate this icon with that fallacy. So as we're covering this with the students always ask me, well, Mr. Stamper, what icon can we associate with this?
Yeah.
And it's a good visual way to help them remember these biases and fallacies.
Wouldn't it be helpful during like a political debate or something like that if those icons would just pop up on the screen?
I think there's a viral video you could make there for YouTube.
Oh, I think that would work.
Monetize it and make a fortune.
Yeah. Well, Nathaniel, thank you for coming on today. We're so thankful for the work you're doing with students here, teaching them to think logically and critically. And I think you're right that work is going to bear fruit and bear fruit year after year after year. So thank you.
It is my privilege.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Leola, Pennsylvania. If you would like to learn more about Veritas, please visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.